There we go. Well, it's nice to finally get a chance to talk to you directly,
Yes, likewise.
as opposed to a estuary convo. So, where do you want to begin? You want to start with your story? What would you like to do?
Yeah, little background probably be good. I listen to your story quite a bit, and I see quite a lot of similarity. I was just listening about how you describe yourself as a missionary kid. That's very much my background. I was born in Germany, in Munich, and my parents did church work in the city there for about 8 years, and then we moved to Australia, and we were there for 4 years. And I was 12 when I first got to the US. So I always say I'm an MC, I'm a PK, and I'm a TCK, which means a third culture kid. Yeah. Now that's a big part of my background, but I always say, even though I've lived now in Germany probably, I don't know, over 15 to 20 years, I still, that those formative years, I was in the States, high school and college, and that's always what I call my home and the culture I relate to, and that's kind of where I grew up, right?
Wow. Where did your parents grow up?
They grew up in Oregon.
Okay.
Yeah, they both of them grew up on farms.
Okay.
And my family background, Mennonite, and so both my parents grew up, wearing coverings. My grandfather had one of those straight coats that they called, and in fact, my dad, his family, they moved to Canada when he was a teenager, out really way up north. They live next to an Indian reservoir or a Native Canadian reservation, and my grandfather was a pastor there.
Oh, wow.
Both my parents grew up in Mennonite communities, grew up on farms, and then they left Oregon pursuing ministry, really, and it took them overseas. Yeah.
Where were your parents in terms of immigration? Did their grandparents immigrate, or had they been in the United States for generations?
Yeah, that's to what degree? Definitely, it was several generations already in the US, but my family was one of those families that kept pushing west. That's the story. They go, they came into Ohio, then they moved to Nebraska, there was Oklahoma, and there's a family story that I think it was, what was that, the sodbusters there, the famine, the drought, they had to pack up their bags, left Oklahoma, and came to a sign, basically a fork in the road. Do we go to California or do we go to Oregon?
Yep.
So my family is probably about two, 3 generations in Oregon. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because there's, I've noticed a fair amount of commonalities between, let's say, the Christian Reformed Church, which tended to be, Dutch immigrant, but also quite communitarian, especially for much of their history. And Mennonite communities, tend to be very deep communitarian values within the tradition.
Yeah.
So what kind of missionary work were your parents doing?
Well, they in Munich, they basically did a church plant. There was a young fledgling church, and my parents came in and gave leadership to that and started a church. There was kind of a group of German Mennonites during that period in the 70s where they tried to plant a number of churches, and so they asked a mission board in America to help, and my parents went over. So my mother was pregnant with me when they moved to Germany.
Okay. Yeah. What kind of, let's see, how do I ask this in an intelligible way? You'll understand it, but I want the audience to understand it.
Yeah.
What was the so in the Christian Reformed Church, of course, we sort of had our Dutch immigrant CRC, but when it went into church planting mode, they usually sort of took missiology off the shelf of what was going on at the time. Where were these church planters sort of located in those, missiological conversations?
That's a really good question. I mean, there's two answers. Is that one is that I think my parents, I don't think followed necessarily any of the big trends of the day.
Okay.
And I think that's also kind of a little bit, the Mennonite community tends to do that somewhat too. It was not a church growth type approach.
Okay.
If that says anything.
Was it evangelical in the American sense rather than the German sense?
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things we'll end up talking about. I mean, I think I've heard just in general, where does Anabaptism fit into this whole discussion about Christianity in the West, in America? I find I'm always fascinated to hear you talk about the CRC. There's so many parallels there, but Anabaptism has its own unique strain. And one of the things is it's, I would say a metric that tends to apply to missiology is that it's not one of effectiveness it's at its center of its value. It's, it's kind of the long-term faithfulness. How do you serve? How do you connect with people? I think there would be in mission work, particularly, there would be no problem talking about faith or talking about, maybe if in an evangelical way, preaching the gospel type of thing, but it's usually not one of of bluster or confidence in a way that maybe you would see in other kinds of ways. To be flashy, to be, all those things just isn't necessarily what you find in Mennonite communities. Right. Now, my parents moved to Germany. Imagine this, my mother she wore a head covering during that period is when they stopped wearing it, because it was such an odd thing to wear that in a context like Germany where nobody would look at you you'd be Mormon or Jehovah's Witness type of thing. So that's the period of time where my parents changed their dress also. Yeah.
Well, and that's interesting to me because, for all of one of the things the Christian Reformed Church has not done, and perhaps if you think about my estuary work as sort of, undercover church planting in some way, maybe I'm doing it by having an estuary meeting in the Netherlands, but
I have some questions about that.
No Christian Reformed Church ever decided they were going to send missionaries back to the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And so to have Mennonite, probably with German ancestry, because many of the Mennonites in North America are German Mennonites, to have the descendants of German Mennonites send missionaries back to Germany in the 1970s and 80s is super interesting.
Yeah.
And partly because of the unique, it's hard for people to appreciate sort of the unique religious context that these waves of religious immigrants made in the American religious scene. So you do have, I don't know how many Amish remain in Germany, but they're, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Julian, who's, in our little corner of the internet with his Hutterites up there in Manitoba. So and to a certain degree, the Dutch Calvinists, the CRC, also came to America, and something sort of freezes when you leave. And so, Europe just kept changing. And so the idea of sending missionaries back to do church planting just sort of really fascinates me.
Yeah. Well, I had a quick question. How long did the Dutch, how long did they retain Dutch as a language in CRC churches?
You can still find a few services now and then in Dutch, but it was during the First World War because Dutch and Deutsch were just too darn close. And actually a Christian Reformed church was burned to the ground in one rural community because anti-German sentiment during the First World War was very hot. So at that point, the immigrants that came over before the First World War said, we've got to learn English. We've got to have English in the service. We can't have people thinking we're Germans. Now, the wave that came over after the Second World War, so my family came over in the wave before the First World War. Then there was a new, smaller wave of Dutch immigration after the Second World War that went to mostly Canada and the Western United States. They very much had an ethos of, we're in a new land, we're going to speak the language, we're going to, they still weren't Canadians or Americans so much, but they very much were going to accommodate and dig in. But they were very different immigrants than the ones who came over in the 1890s when my ancestors came. No,
I think the First World War had a big impact as well as language in the Mennonite communities, and it was probably even a double whammy, because then there was also the conscientious objector thing. So it was definitely a lot of tension during that time as well. Now you find in some Mennonite communities in North America still speak some German, but they tend to be then the immigrants that came through Russia, because they've come later in a sense. They were a later wave, and so just like in North America, in Russia, they retained their German culture and language for a much longer time in those parts as well. So I mean, the story of Mennonite history is really one of migration, and it continues today even, because most Mennonites in the world are not of European heritage, and many are moving to the West for all kinds of reasons. And so, for example, we lived in Los Angeles. I studied, did my theological training there, and
what seminary?
Missiology training there, and we worked
at what school? Where did you study in LA?
Fuller. I went to Fuller.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Fuller School of World Missions.
Well, it was called the School of Intercultural Studies at that time.
Okay.
Yeah. And my wife and I, we were youth pastors at a Indonesian church, and that was a Mennonite church. So at that point in time in Los Angeles, there were about 36 Mennonite churches or so, and probably only 2 or 3 had that that European ancestry. They were from everywhere else, from Guatemala to Belize, Indonesian, Congolese, and that's been the story for at least the Mennonite denomination of the last 50, 80 years or so, is that it's become a global church.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's fascinating. Oh gosh, I mean, you put this stuff in front of me. I'm just so fascinated by culture and church. I've always been. And because the closest Mennonite Brethren church to us is Greenhaven Neighborhood Church, which is just right down Florin Road. I know one family from that church quite well, because one young man once approached me, called me up cold and said, "I want you to be my mentor." It's like, well, who are you? Well, I'm Reformed. I said, well, how did you get Reformed? He says, well, I got Reformed on the internet. And it's like, and then, I got to know him. We'd started getting together with him, and he grew up in a Mennonite community, and he sort of got swept up in the young, restless, and Reformed, and then got to know his father and his mother died. And so his father's actually been on the Freddie and Paul show a few times. He's the Jesus man. So I've been, but so it's very interesting looking at, whereas sort of the CRC is sort of a small group, the Anabaptists they just don't fit easily onto all of these scales that sort of usually the media hive mind tries to look at American Christianity through.
I absolutely. And I think I relate mainly to the Mennonite Mennonite Church USA. That's the church I relate to, and there are many different groups. So it's hard to talk about it because it's a very decentralized thing. I sometimes say I have affinity to the Jewish communities because we have the ultra Orthodox, we have the kind of secular almost version, because Mennonite, at least for the previous generations, has often meant a kind of a cultural heritage as well, right?
Yes.
And it's always something. How much of it is a religious as well as a cultural identity, right? And that's something that many have to work through, and I think is actually a big part of what's going on internally in the church these days, especially the bigger denomination that I'm a part of. And that's the fault line really in a lot of these debates within the church, as if you've been talking about in CRC. I mean, I find that strong pull to identifying with the broader culture, to kind of the virtues and values of where we're heading in the secular world, and how to talk to the world in those type of terms, and then the pulling back and into holy communities, and finding particularly the evangelical brand to be quite powerful, because it's so clear on its identity and so clear in its convictions in terms of faith. And so that fault line runs right through the middle. And we have this weird, but we also have this weird, you called it a crosswinds. And I think that's absolutely true, because we have a different relationship to church and imperialism throughout history, right? That's been a critique maybe Anabaptists have given to the church. I mean, at least, to the differentiation between the magisterial reform and the Anabaptists is that we do want to separate from state. We want to make it a voluntary religion. It's all those types of things. And and so it's fascinating to read a book like Dominion, which I think does a really good job of, I mean, I had a whole Anabaptist group that we read it because it was actually healthy. I'll tell you this, it was healthy to read his perspective and to put the pieces of Christian history together and realize, there's so much more to this story, and how complex, of course there is, but we kind of say there was Constantine, and then the church was never good after that, right?
That's right.
and it wasn't until the Anabaptists in the 15th century revitalized the true church, and so we don't even go through the Enlightenment. We go all the way back to the early church, and that's when we,
That's so. I picked up this book before. This is from Christian Reformed Church Publishing, My Church, and basically you start. Well, this is church, and you start with the Bible, the Old Testament, and then Jesus and the early church, and then whoop, there, before you know it, we're back at the Reformation. And of course the Anabaptists, well, there never was I assume there never was an Anabaptist state church. I mean, it's just
there was Munster.
There was Munster, and it didn't go well.
Didn't go well. That's when I think that's when Anabaptism kind of really took its form after that, and it was a Dutch leader that Menno Simons. Yeah, and he had the attribute of being elusive. He wasn't killed, and he did it for many, like I think he was 30 years or so in ministry, and he kind of his ability to network all these different churches, all these different groups.
Hang on a second. I got a whole group of ladies here, and someone just banged on my door in a way that I'm uncomfortable with. Just stay right here.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I get women's Bible study here on Tuesday, and if most of our unmedicated schizophrenics, they can get they'll try things with women they won't try with me. So I just got to make sure everything's cool. But I know who banged on the door, and so I know it's not a problem. Anyway, where were we?
We were at Menno Simons and Münster, and I was just going to say that I do think you can't underestimate how important Münster was for shaping the future of Anabaptism, where particularly a leader like Menno Simons clearly said, we are not going to, that is not us, and we will have a different approach. And I think that quiet in the land is often what that's how you sum up the experience of Mennonites and Amish, kind of pulling back and being quiet in the land. Yeah.
What's interesting about, but one of the things that's interesting me about Anabaptism is how so a lot of what has characterized Protestantism is either it's full embrace or full reactive posture to modernity.
Yeah.
And so some of those dynamics, I mean, some Anabaptist communities became very theologically liberal. Some became very politically progressive.
Yes.
And some have remained enormously conservative. And so it's interesting to see that whole spectrum. I mean, the same is true with Calvinists. You have tremendous, but it's interesting watching how that plays differently among Anabaptists.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a certain, this is the way I think about it, a certain susceptibility to, I think, kind of the modern, the current virtues of today that seem to be so good, because when you really do believe in peace, and say that that's a distinctive of our theology and our tradition, there is a critique of people of my generation and younger and a little bit older that this quiet in the land, you didn't do anything. We need to do something with it. And so it tends to, people then start running with that and really get drawn into anything that is about peace really becomes what becomes important. And I find that language particularly has very much taken over the kind of the idea of what the church is all about on the right and on the left. And it's one of those things, is like, as somebody, I've seen this dynamic, this snowball roll for a while now. You can't say anything against peace. It's like how do you yeah.
Well, although some people are kind of making a case, I mean, wokeism to a certain degree has, and Anabaptism has that prophetic strain in its tradition too.
Yeah.
But always non-violently, which is welcome.
Yeah. Well, and this is, I think, but this is why where we're at in our cultural war today, it's been something it's had a long run up already in our denomination. So when I went to university in the late 90s, I graduated in 2000. I went to a Mennonite university, and I was part of the first graduating class with the degree of the Justice, Peace, and Conflict Studies. Okay.
Yep.
So that was wokeism 101 20 years ago. And I struggled in that degree then and have since with this. And what I always said, I felt like I was taught a worldview. And I went through the ringer on it, because I personally was not at a place where I was calling myself Christian or committing to that. But I also wasn't absolutely rebellious against my roots or even just religion in general. I was still trying to figure it out. Whereas that kind of pitchfork and torch bearing kind of nature of the people that it collected was very much part of the milieu of the people that I went to university of. We just got to burn this whole thing down. And so I still have that experience is still so formative that I find myself struggling with even today, like, should I be this? I mean, I care about it so much because it's so much part of my story, but I'm still like, can't I just let this go? You know, like, isn't there something else to focus on? Like, you know, and I have that internal struggle. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's so visceral still, because now it's not just on a little Mennonite campus. This is out in the everywhere now, and it's the same kind of thing that I dealt with a long time ago, or just an evolution of that. I mean, you know, and yeah. So this is a big part of how I've think about our denomination, and so in some ways there's a lot of capture to that type of thing in our denomination, because we believe in peace as something that's very fundamental to like what the church's witness in the world should be, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's that same kind of in wokeism, like, of course, you know, sexism, racism, all these things. Who's against those kinds of things? You're put on a weird foot to argue against those kinds of things, or argue against, or try to articulate it in another way, right?
Right. Well, and I very much had the same experience, because my father's church was very much a racial reconciliation church in Paterson, New Jersey. It was sort of a Dutch, a CRC mercy mission to the African Americans who were taking these jobs in the New York metropolitan area. And then, of course, the civil rights movement came along. And so the church, which was mostly Black, had to at least have a posture with respect to that entire movement. And so, in my college years, I was reading Sojourners and The Other Side. And so in many ways, in terms of the peace and justice side of the Christian Reformed Church, Mennonites were, I was reading, Russ Siders was a huge book in the 70s, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. And, before all the sexual allegations came out, reading The Politics of Jesus. If you were sort of on the left end of an evangelical, roughly evangelical church, the Mennonites were in many ways sort of the Anabaptists were sort of the vanguard, because they'd been doing peace and justice. And of course, this is the 70s too. So it's, whereas during the First and Second World War, to be a Anabaptist is an uncomfortable thing. During the Vietnam War, now you guys are, we've been doing peace movements since, we were getting our teeth kicked in by the rest of the Protestants and the Catholics. So you guys were the OG, peaceniks. And so that was, I always had a, very good, despite what the Belgic Confession says, which of course reflects Jan of Leiden and Munster. The Anabaptists have for many Protestants sort of on the left, not all the way over to liberalism, but still, because the Mennonites seem to be a people that could, at least to many degrees, maintain a degree of theological orthodoxy, crunchiness as compared to modernity. Jesus really did die on the cross. Jesus really did rise from the dead. All of these things, and be about peace and justice and racial reconciliation, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. No, and I think, that's what I think is the struggle today, is how to articulate a peace and justice in that kind of perspective in the church, and not get caught up in the nomenclature and of the trends of the day, right? And that's a big, I studied justice, peace, and conflict studies, but it's a very, I lament the loss of, I think, identity in where all that comes from. I think that's why it's so fascinating to read Dominion, which basically lays out all the you can't take the Christian out of all the good virtues that we think of today. And I'm like, that's, I know exactly what's there. And we always, I think Anabaptists have always had a focus on the Christian life, right? The disciple, the living out of faith. And I think that was the place, or that was the intersection of where you could keep those things always together. It had to play out in real life. But now I think the wokeism, in a sense, is applied in a way that it is not a theoretical, and it is a lifestyle in not just, I mean, it has an ideological bent to it, of course, as well, but it is so easy to then practice that in so many ways. And it's almost more permeable, or it permeates everything even more than how you would say it coming from there's no competition if you're coming at it from a Christian church where you say, oh, we pray. Well, they save the world.
That's right.
Yeah.
Who needs prayer when you've got saving to do?
Yeah. Yeah.
And prayer is just for people who, prayer is just for people who are have some moral defect that's keeping them from real action. Yeah.
I do have a question in here, because I think this has a lot to do with, I would say, the leadership and future leadership in the church, right? How young people looking to serve in church work and church ministry. And I've been at that part of the conversation for a long time and been paying attention to that, because I was one of the few that went to an evangelical, seminary, and one of the few that has studied missiology. All my peers went and studied development work and peace studies, international relations. And I feel like there's been my whole generation got trained as activists and organizers and world changers, and I'm one of the few. There's just compared to the generation before, a lot less that are interested and invested in the church as the place of where we see our, call to serve and to be part of. It's just a dramatic drop off, right?
Yeah. And
now you see that drop off again. And I'm working in a context like Germany, where that's just that cliff, that's just even a steeper cliff of like who's coming after, right? That's a huge question.
Well, and I saw this answer of why do you need to bear witness to something countercultural when, in a sense, you've won? So the culture is all about, or at least pro forma, this is what we say, the culture, the government. In a sense, the Anabaptists have inherited the state as such, or maybe half of the political world. But I guess this, obviously for eschatology comes to play in this.
Yeah.
Because part of where, people are interested in anti-racism, wonderful. They're interested in anti-poverty, wonderful. They're interested in, we're not going to marginalize, we're not going to, now I don't know who's knocking at my door. Gosh, hang on a second. Sorry. Hey, I want to talk about ministry to the poor, and the poor keep bothering me. I just have so little confidence in our present systems that they either have the durable commitment or capacity to actually help, instead of simply posturing in order to win votes and acclaim and moral status. Because I sit here and I listen to all of the talk, but I sit here in the middle of it. It's like, no, y'all ain't doing squat. And I'm not even convinced you have any interest in it. And then especially when I see all these young white people that are just so woke, and it's like, well, if you really want to help people, you can come over here and I'll help you get to know people, and you can actually help people. They're like, they're scary. It's like, what did you expect? that it was going to be easy. You know, no, it's not easy. You'll probably spend your life and get almost nowhere. And that's why I have zero. That's why, you know, I continue to believe, and this is where I think probably we both end up, that you in fact need a regenerated heart and a very vivid eschatological vision of the risen Christ to actually pour your life out sacrificially in service of the people that you say you want to help. Because in this age, you're only going to get so far in a lifetime. So, and I think that's where, you know, people who are theologically conservative, that's what they can continue to maintain. And so when everybody decides that they can go out and use all of our skills to bring in the eschaton, it's like, okay, I'm dubious. Show me your fruit.
Yeah. What is CRC doing for developing the leaders of the future of the, I mean, it sounds from what you're saying, it's also more aging denomination. I've heard through the lines a little bit there. You know, seminaries were such a bastion of leadership training, but it doesn't seem to be maybe the same as it once was, or,
you know, this stuff gets so complex. So 100 years ago, the brightest and the best of the denomination would often go into ministerial service.
Yeah.
Because that seemed to be the cutting edge. And, you know, we had this world and life view following Abram Kuyper, Herman Bavinck of sphere sovereignty. And so many went into other things. And the cutting edge was, you know, there was a subtle theological shift from eschatology, you know, within eschatology to, well, how much can we in fact bring in the kingdom with our technology and our social science and our money and our power? And what sort of shifts then is, well, we've got these limited resources within the church. What if we had the kind of power a government has?
Yeah.
And for the historical amnesiacs, they sort of forget that, well, this is kind of where everything was at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, until, of course, you know, Europe decided to, I love Philip Jenkins' book on the religious aspects of the First World War, because that in many ways were these different empires, and they all were empires. I mean, Germany was an empire, France was an empire, England was an empire. The Dutch used to have an empire, but sort of got eaten by the English. And it was a catastrophe. You know, it was a catastrophe. But yet here we are still imagining, well, we can wipe out the sources of our suffering. But what they very quickly realize is your anthropology is way too materialist, in that you think the sources of your suffering are what? Privation. Mm-hmm. And right now we're in the midst of a world where, well, we've done pretty well in wiping out privation in terms of material, but now we've got, you know, I was just listening to Jonathan Haidt and Jordan Peterson. Jonathan Haidt makes the point, Gen Z is the most depressed generation we've got.
Yeah.
So, you know, more stuff? No, that ain't going to do it. So, and so, yes, in some ways, the vision of at least the theological conservative Christians had their finger on an anthropological point, a theological anthropology that actually was telling. And many of those who rushed out to do community development and many fine projects that have, especially in other places in the world, are certainly welcome. We can certainly use better sanitation and nutrition and all of those things in many places in the world. Yet our theological anthropology is deficient, and that deficiency is showing, especially in the developed world.
Yeah.
So to me, part of this is, it's not arbitrary that Jonathan Peugeot was in the Congo with the Mennonite Central Committee.
But I was just a few months ago that I read that and I was like, oh, he was with Mennonite Central Committee, MCC. Yeah.
And probably, in my first conversation with him, as I usually do, wheedle people's stories out of them because I'm nosy. And, he was there to, for him, he was there to sort of look at the crafts, tradition that they have there. And so he's done a lot of his carving from that soapstone that he'd get there. And he's got to get a new supply because Congo's not the easiest place in the world to do business. And But what was an artist doing from the Mennonite Central Committee in Congo? And you and I sort of know, but a lot of people out there would be, what's that about? And that obviously was integral in Jonathan's continued journey then into orthodoxy and icon carving. None of that is arbitrary.
Yeah.
So
do you know when he was there?
I can't tell you off the top of my head. He's at least 10 years younger than I am. So I would imagine, I was overseas in the 90s. He was probably there in the 2000s, I would guess.
Yeah. I have a good friend who got killed in the Congo he had worked for MCC.
Well, Peugeot has a video out where he describes, where he almost lost his life. I mean, that was a very dangerous place.
Yeah.
But, and again, and this is back to, I have very little respect for many of the current activists because I knew the religious activists of the 70s, and I continue to know the conservative religious missionaries today, where they in fact will put their lives on the line and lay it down. And they're not imagining that activism can be somehow at the level of watching Netflix and, still have a life of, happiness and celebration and hedonism. Whereas, religious missionaries have always known, no, I pursue this work out of joy, fully understanding it's going to cost me a lot.
Yeah.
And I willingly lay down my life. That's what religion will do.
Yeah.
But okay, well, we're not going to be religious. We're just going to jump straight to the fruit. Well, then you're just going to, Goldman Sachs helps the world too. Okay.
No, there's an ethic to self-sacrifice that doesn't just come from by itself.
Exactly.
And I, as a pacifist, I spent, when I moved to Germany after university, I worked with U.S. soldiers stationed here. I worked for a little organization. It was during the second Iraq War. And there were at that time still many stationed in Germany and many that were then deployed to Afghanistan and to Iraq. And we ran an organization called the Military Counseling Network. And so we gave GI rights counseling to soldiers stationed here. And we did all kinds of, anybody that had questions about military regulations, Army mainly, some Marine, they would call us up and we'd help them. But we worked specifically then and quite intensely also then with conscientious objectors, right? But I got to know several hundred soldiers during that time. And I think I was inspired by their understanding of sacrifice. And that is the military knows that. They have to. It's part of the way things operate in the military. And people that go into the military they don't maybe comprehend, but they understand that that's part of the job.
Right.
And I think as a pacifist, I could relate really well to soldiers because there was an ethic of self-sacrifice there that we could bond on, because if you really do want to change things, it can cost a lot.
Yeah.
And that's just not part of the DNA of a lot of this new, all the new ideas of how to make the world a better place. And it's missing that. There's a fundamental component to that. It's not grounded in the same, I'm not saying it's all wishful thinking, but of course you can say, wouldn't it be great if there was no racism? Yes, it would be great. It would be great. But how do you do that? That is a difficult thing because it's very complicated. Like you've talked about, I grew up in our church in where I grew up in Virginia, was in basically the black part of town, and we were a multicultural church. Our church building was built where the colored pool, that was the property that was belonged to in the city there, where the colored pool was, and the city offered to give it to the church for free. And we decided, no, we want to buy it. We want to own it. We want to show the community that's, and in fact, my first pastor was black. So I grew up in that kind of thing. And that's just a very different starting point for any kind of conversation about any of this, that you just like, I don't even know where to begin on how to, of course, racism bad. I mean, that's easy to say. That's just easy. Yeah. But go try anything.
Go ahead and end it.
Yeah.
Now, what are you doing in Germany now? What's your job? What do you spend your time doing?
I have several different hats. We work for the German Mennonite Church. I'm employed by them, and my role is to start as a church planning here in Mannheim, which is a decent sized city in the southwest. And then I work also more regionally, basically in resourcing for churches, and kind of, I would say, what word do you want to use? Mobilizing, missional type stuff, whatever the good buzzword is. But it's basically trying to, I think, to encourage people to try to start to break through, to try new things, because it's a culture of not trying anything new. It's in steep decline, it's nervous, it's wounded, it's hurt, and it's very not sure of what the future will bring. And so people just get more cautious and aren't willing to try new things often. So I'm kind of in a group of people that try out new things. So one of the things I do a lot of work with is young adults, and we do online discipleship program. And that's something that I spend a lot of time with. In terms of church planning, well, Corona wasn't very fun, but my main role is, I think, to connect. And I'm always interested about where people are at. And I feel like a role is you feel how to connect to people, but you're also trying to connect to the deeper questions they have in life. And I have, of course, a whole set of presuppositions and biases and everything. And you could easily put everything into that framework, but that's not the task. It's also to understand the culture and where are people coming from, and where are they looking, where do they need connection, not just looking for a connection, because that's not always necessarily the right thing in their life. But we're trying to figure out how to build community and to work in a more missionary posture in a church. It's not a very good recipe for success, because we're kind of starting with people that have no relationship to the church, right? And in particularly in Western Europe and most of Europe, it's a very de-churched culture. I mean, some people have still some connections, but most people have absolutely they maybe went as a child still to the confirmation or were, baptized, but most people have nothing to do with religion or church. and it's a very deeply secular and what we call post-Christian context. And so that's kind of my starting point. And that's where Estuary comes in a little bit, because naturally I have those kinds of connections and conversations with people, and I don't have a very good place to invite people to, though, to have more, to have more meaningful conversation with others. You can't do that in a church context very well. A church already has its program. It has its, this is what it's going to do. And I actually, through church planning, I've learned that, it's okay to be church. It's okay to say, this is what we do. We don't need to change. I don't need to be cutting edge, cool, whatever. We're going to read the Bible. We're going to pray, those kinds of things. Because at the end of the day, church is for people that want that, be part of that community. Right.
Yeah.
And but the other part is, how do I connect and actually connect with people, because people do want to connect. That's the other thing, is that people do want to be talking about these things, but there's no space for that in in a culture like this, where maybe at the bar, maybe, maybe when you're jogging, but it often the frameworks are not there to talk about the deeper questions of life.
Right.
There isn't a forum anymore. There's no synagogue or church or mosque at the center of culture where people go to learn about life or wisdom or any, all these things that we've been talking about. That doesn't exist anymore in culture. You go to Netflix. That's probably the biggest place where people explore ideas, maybe implicitly, about the life and everything.
Or YouTube. It's
YouTube.
Because, now that I've been doing this, YouTube, I think in some ways is becoming a space where at least there are videos being made about these things. And, we've got, obviously on the Discord server, we have some of that going, but, Grim Grizz has been making videos about mine, and, we're trying to use it to get some, to at least simulate conversation to a degree. But no, you're right. And I mean, it sounds like you and I missiologically are coming at this from a very similar place. And when I think about, more in the United States, we have mega churches who have been, I got to be careful here, because where does evangelism happen in the United States, and what does it look like? That's a very big topic. And even especially in a culture where part of the wokeism has made religious proselytization, forbidden. Because, well, no, you're imposing, that's a colonial thing that you're imposing. Oh, well, I suppose I'll just have the Nigerian immigrants do it then. Because they are.
In Mannheim are the only ones that do that downtown.
Yeah.
That's who you're going to find on the street corner giving out.
Yeah. And the Mormons. The Mormons are going door to door, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. And the, yoga studios are sort of preaching a soft Buddhism, New Age thing. I mean, religion is still happening.
Well, but this is the funny thing, is as somebody who calls themselves a missionary, I proselytize very little compared to most people I know.
Yeah. No, and until YouTube, that was true for me too. Yeah. And that was sort of what Jordan Peterson opened up, because I could go a long time before having what I would consider an evangelistic conversation with someone one-on-one. Yeah. And for me, in many ways, most of what I'm doing now when I'm having those conversations is in fact online. much
Yes.
more than in person.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's accidental, because I mean, these black mirrors, as Grim Grizz likes to call them, others have called them that too, obviously. Something's going on psychologically that I can say things online that are a little bit different to say in person.
Yep.
So,
And you can, when I said there's no space, I think you're right when you say no, YouTube is a space, because then that explains Jordan Peterson. You can watch. You can go and listen to somebody talk, because, well, because it doesn't exist anywhere else, but it is you can do that anonymously, and you can check things out in a way that is very true, I think. And I think that what I think YouTube then reveals is that there's much more of a, you can call it a yearning or a hunger to search those things out. I
Yes.
mean, YouTube in a sense becomes the meaning center.
yes.
I mean, where it expresses the people's desire to find meaning in a really interesting way in our culture.
Right. And so, in the seeker days, so you go into a church in the 60s and 70s, or still you go into certain churches today, and you're a visitor, they want you to stand up and say your name and where you're from. And in the seeker movement, they said, you got to cut that out, because people want to slide into the mega church, sit in the back row. They might sing a little bit like this because they feel a little uncomfortable singing in public, but it's loud. So, and all the music coming at them. So it's sort of like singing with the headphones on. So they sing a little bit and they'll listen to the pastor, and then they'll sneak out. And that's the way they want it. YouTube is, of course, the total, stay anonymous. You don't even have to log into YouTube. I mean,
Yeah.
a third of my viewers are not, and they'll contact me, say, I don't have a YouTube channel, so I don't leave comments. Oh, I got somebody else at the door. Where are deacons to take care of the poor for me so I can preach the word? So the YouTube is just perfect for stalker mode. But the thing that I noted right away with Jordan Peterson was he was really getting people going, and they needed to talk about it, because you can't just absorb. You've got to, if you're going to process, you need a back and forth. And that's, of course, where groups come in, because, but you needed something. The YouTube was, in some ways was supposed to be doing the teaching, preaching, homiletical kerugma. But you needed the fellowship, you needed the koinonia. And there's no place to do it. And again, the difficult thing is that churches are not I can't say they're not built to it, because we've had small groups and small group Bible studies. We've had some of that, but that's not the entry that people needed. So
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this, because when you're doing church planning, you ask a lot of fundamental questions about what is church, right? It's and a basic one is, what am I inviting people to?
Right.
And again, to go back to the early church, I am inspired by, I think I sent you the book once to recommend to you, Patient Ferment. It's a Mennonite author, talking about what made the early church unique in its context, and why did it actually, why did it have the story and maybe the success it had. And he puts a frame on it, and one of the things he points out in the whole chapter on the catechism, which was a pretty long process for new people to come in to the into the church. And it was fascinating to read this, because I thought, wow, there are so many parallels to today, where it took a long time, and it even took like a year sometimes before they would even invite them, allow them to join in worship or in any kind of thing. Now, there was a context there, which is persecution or maybe political tension, those kinds of things. Not always, but that you have to factor that in. But the idea that I thought was so, that I thought was such a powerful one, is that the church in itself was fairly invisible in the culture. You did not, when you encountered anybody that was Christian, you encountered Christians, not the church. So it was people in everyday life. It was in the market. It was the neighborhood, in the courtyard. That's where all of this happened, with any kind of learning about what, and maybe watching these communities from afar. But that was the visible part. It was not, and it changed quite a bit. And I think this is the mindset that we still deal with today, is that church became very visible in our culture. And we still assume that as the church, that all we have to do is be visible, and then people will come. I think that's really deep down in what many churches, when they think, if we just do the right program, if we just do the right type of service, or, and that's kind of the seeker, they did it really well. They did it really well.
Yeah.
But the culture changed.
Yeah.
It's not a culture anymore looking at the church as a place to, that's where you go with life's questions. That's where you go with problems. That's where you seek out community. That just doesn't, that's not reality today.
Yeah.
But we still act as if that is. And so that's what I mean. Sometimes we put so much pressure on ourselves to be the church to the world, when sometimes that's not even, we're not used to being Christians in a world that doesn't know who Christians are.
Well, and
that's
back
the
to
mythological part of me, which says we need to learn that again. And for me, that's what Estuary absolutely is that I can be a little bit visible in that. And it's not because I'm trying to get them into something else, but I can be who I am. And I really am excited about the potential of being more authentic in that space, because I think other people are looking for those kinds of authentic encounters with people that say, hey, I look at the world this way.
I think that's true. Part, I think, of what has changed too, a la, again, Tom Holland and Dominion, so I'm working on just a couple of different things. One, so the last couple of weeks I've posted my adult Sunday school recording to my main channel. And it's always interesting. And I've done my rough drafts from fairly early on in the channel, but they are really rough drafts. But the recordings, I don't usually post my sermons. I've got a variety of reasons for that. But what you say about, what we're doing in church is in many ways for us.
Right.
This is for us. And that hasn't changed. So now I'm paying a lot of attention to the Roman Empire, Paul's context of the Eastern Roman Empire in the first century, various, we know a lot more about that historically than we did even 100 years ago. And the Christians, you get the sense, and of course, not all of them were, but the Christians had to be in some ways deeply countercultural.
Yes.
In some pretty significant ways. And again, in Christendom and now post-Christendom, that's not what we're used to. And we haven't been used to it for 15, 16, 1700 years.
Yeah.
And so when and that's uneven, especially in places like the United States. It's very different in Texas than it is in California or Oregon or Washington. And it's different still in New England, where obviously you're in the land founded by Puritans, and some of that remains in the architecture, in the culture, but a lot of that is, or in the congregational, the hyper liberal congregation, or the Unitarian churches that dot these towns. And this time of year, people are taking lovely pictures of those beautiful Unitarian churches with the colored leaves, and there's a nostalgia there. But how the church can function in this culture now evangelistically, when in many ways, even in the church, we're by no means on the same page with respect to our posture towards the culture.
Right.
And that's where mainline, fundamentalist, evangelical, Anabaptist, now Orthodox and Roman Catholic,
yeah,
so many moving pieces.
I think you bring, as an Anabaptist, I'm like, yes, there's always a countercultural component, right, to, I think, just the kingdom. That's, for me, that's something I would say theologically is just there. But to go back to the Mennonite experience right now, we've been so counter Christendom for so long that it's so easily to now become counter Christian, because the culture is so critical of Christendom, right? It's there are allies now in the critique, right? And so that just takes more out the door, and you suddenly are kind of going against the wrong thing almost. And that's what I see happening. In our tradition, when it comes to, I will say, I'll speak, this is very broad and I'm going to make some people mad, but my observation in from the more liberal context of Christianity in Germany and Northern Europe particularly, that those expressions of church are almost they're going extinct. It's and part of the challenge there, and I think, again, Dominion just does this so well, they have a hard time then distinguishing themselves from culture eventually, because there's so much overlap. So with what the values of what you think the ultimate highest values are in the world, and they struggle often, the more left side or the liberal side struggle more with that than the conservative side.
Yeah.
And it's, so just to give an example here, in Mannheim, we have, it's a Protestant area for the most part, kind of mixed, but the city itself has been historically more of a Protestant city, and has a very large established Protestant apparatus here. And we work, right, we actually, one of the projects we partner with the Protestant church. So I'm very close friends with many, but there's about 22 churches here in Mannheim, quite a large, and you probably have a membership of 80 to 100,000 people, right? But you go to any church service in any of those, and you'll probably find between 10 to 30 to 40 people gathered on a Sunday morning. And you're going to probably, and then they'll all be all over the age of about 60, probably.
Wow.
Okay. And the church is basically financially struggling. They have these old buildings. It's so hard. And there is no youth group there's no young adult youth group in all of Mannheim for the Protestant church that's organized with the church. They have their confirmation groups. Those numbers are all down, but then there's no group older than that the church, because I know the youth pastor for the whole, he's trying to do stuff, but that's massive. For a city, and to have no youth group.
Wow.
I mean, think about that for a
Yeah.
minute.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Not in
that's
America.
no, but that's very different. I mean, and just
Yeah.
so the amount of post-Christianity is just absolute almost, and
Yeah.
it's existential right now for churches like the Protestant church or the Evangelische, because now they're trying to figure out what to do with all these bills. Like there's like millions in debt here in the city because you have all these buildings you can't get rid of because anybody who's going to buy them have to invest millions into it. And then what do you do with a church building unless you're a church? So no church wants to, and you can't really tear them down, and then, and you can't really commercialize them in the way that you would meet the investment, or you have to desacralize, whatever you call that process. I mean, it's all very complicated. Yeah.
Is it different with the Roman Catholics?
Now that's interesting. Now, this is not a Catholic area, but from what I've learned, they're much more of a vibrant expression, mainly because of, again, migrant populations. We have good Croatian friends that are Catholic. They live right here in the neighborhood, and they, they'll go to Croatian Catholic mass, and there'll be hundreds of people there. And I asked them, do you go to the German Catholic mass? Oh, no. I said, well, have you been there? Yeah. But like, how many people go there? Like 20 people or so. So that's the first time we actually went and visited them. They have daughters that are kind of young adult teenagers, and they were all at a festival. I forget what the religious service was. That church service in the evening. And I was like, where am I? Like, what young adult go to a church service in the evening? That just doesn't exist. And so they came later to the dinner because they all were at this. Yeah. No, the Catholics in general, I would say, have a little bit more. It's hard to generalize. In the German context, the Protestant church has been a little bit more educated, a little bit more part of the elite culture. I would say the Catholic, I like to say they're more countercultural because they have the odd position of being more countercultural today compared to most other churches because of their stance on divorce and women in leadership, all the social issues. They're at odds compared to all the other churches. And so they have a different presence in Germany. They have a little bit more, I would say, vibrancy in Germany, but they're also in steep decline, but not as quite like the Protestant church.
Are the dynamics between the former East Germany and West Germany different in terms of church?
Yes. The East Germany is considered one of the most secular, atheistic places in Western Europe. But then that's probably where then the Protestant church was the strongest, right? I mean, that becomes more biographical. My wife is from East Germany. She grew up there, and her whole family is from the Evangelische Kirche, and that was a vibrant community during that time. And her parents then moved after the fall of the wall, and they went to the churches in the West, and they're like, oh, this isn't the same at all. And so then they looked for free churches because they wanted to have that same sense of community and life that they had experienced in the Protestant church in East Germany.
In the Protestant church in East Germany under the communists.
Yes. Because there was there was lots of like prayer walk and protest. I mean, the church was at the center of that in many ways. And so my mother-in-law, I mean, she was not allowed to do university studies because she did not join the Communist or the Socialist Party. And then she actually studied to be a deacon, and she she did children's service, and she worked in the church in East Germany. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. There's so much to talk about. But I think the broad frame is that I think the culture has shifted around us, and we're still adjusting as Christians. All over the place, every denomination, and we all have our different inertia or place where we've come from, and we're trying to translate that into a new, but the commonality we have is that we're all in a different, in a new place.
Yeah.
And it's maybe similar to some other parts of history, but it really is a new context. And so that's, what energizes me is when I find others that are interested in talking about culture, because we're trying to get our bearings. I think, to get back to the Anabaptist thing, there's Stanley Hauerwas once said at like a commencement address, I think it was at one of the Mennonite universities, he said, it's the Anabaptists have inherited the world they've always wanted. And it's true. It's this idea, the idea that it's voluntary now. And then he said it very challenging. He said, though, but you guys don't know what to do with it. But I think we're all in that boat a little bit. It is a voluntary world now around us. And in a way that I don't appreciate quite yet. And that goes from my state church colleagues to the Anabaptist. I mean, there's still so much, I think, value in the process that they go through with children and the confirmation and all, but they see that also changing dramatically, right?
Yeah.
It's just,
wow.
Yeah.
Because I think that's right, because I mean, Anabaptism, the meek have inherited the earth, or at least a good part of it. Because in many ways, so many things have sort of, flowed in your direction. I'm just taking notes.
But we don't, and I think, we don't know what to do with it. And I think, I mean, I lament a lot of things, but it's hard to not know how much to obsess about the culture war, and then just on the other hand, just to try to be faithful and just to live out where you placed and where the people you relate to. I mean, we're really excited about the project we're involved with now, because we work for an organization that works with children, and it's not a Mennonite organization, but it is Christian, and we work with the Protestant church in a neighborhood here in Mennonite. It's one of the poorer neighborhoods. It's definitely has social challenges, high alcoholism, high immigration rates, high unemployment, and it's a fascinating neighborhood. It's on the outskirts of the city. It was built by the Nazis in the 30s for Nazi members to get like single dwelling houses, and has this fascinating history. And we got connected with this wonderful a reverend there, who has spent the last 12 years of his life just being with people, and is excited to work with us because we started a community center. So it's in an old kindergarten right next to the church, and we do a cafe essentially, and it's all donation basis, and people come in there because there's no restaurants in that neighborhood. There's pizza delivery. There's no like place to gather like a cafe or anything. And so they come in there and they're like, we can come in here. And so it's almost been nuts because there's been so much going on. We only started in October, but it's for me, it's really exciting to not only do that in that neighborhood, to also be connected, because the church is so energized by it too, because they have now something to do to relate. It's a really, it's been
they have a
really
vital mission.
thing.
Nothing the church loves. They have a vital mission. Nothing the church loves better than a vital mission. I mean, in some ways, some in my congregation feel exactly that way about my YouTube channel. They don't listen to any of it. A lot of it don't understand anything I'm talking about, but it's like, pastor's talking to people on the internet. We got something.
Yes.
It's so true, isn't it?
Yeah. So we're kind of basking in that right now, just the goodwill and but it's like I mean, we don't have it's a very similar feel to what maybe you around your corner, who's going to knock on the door now and what kind of family's going to show up, and but it honestly, that is the antidote for me in all of this, is that it's not all just up here and talking about all these heady stuff. I actually have to rub shoulders with people where, maybe they did vote for the nationalist right party or whatever. Some of them probably did, right? That's the corner where where the highest percentage of it was, right?
Yeah.
But I have to, it's a whole nother way of dealing with real people, and that you just can't replace that.
Nope.
You can't replace that for how you see the world, how you see what it means to be a Christian in this world. I don't. Yeah.
There's no substitute. Well, speaking of real people, I usually don't get this many interruptions, but I knew you'd understand. Hang on, it'll just take a minute. What you just said now is exactly true, and it's part of why people sometimes ask me, well, Paul, if you could like not work for Living Stones and just do YouTube all the time, I wouldn't know what I know now. The on-site ministry acts sort of like a BS detector, that ideas can just start flying around. You get all involved with them, but you got to see them land and work on the ground. Otherwise you just kind of can float away with them. So anyway.
Absolutely.
So we've talked for about an hour and a half. I don't know if you had anything on your list you want to get to, and we don't want to spend all the time with my nosy self badgering you with questions about your world.
No, I think we covered a lot. I had a whole bunch of questions, and topics, but I really appreciated this, and I wanted to talk about church planning and estuary and post-Christianity and Anabaptism. So we covered a lot of the things that we wanted to get to. I think going forward, I'm curious about estuary as something that, and this is to the people in your audience too, that have come more from maybe the Christian side of things, as something how to participate in that and how to create that type of space. Because, from what we're both saying, we think church is a public space in some ways for our culture, but that's not how it works anymore. And so how do we take part in that space we would love to be part of? And I think we also notice that YouTube is definitely part of that. And we're kind of learning how to be Christian in that kind of pluralistic, the different kind of space that we're not used to being in the world in that sense. And I think we've always expected our ecclesiology to do all the hard work for who we are in this world, but we kind of care about that more than anybody else now. And so that's where, that's my bottom line about missiology. I mean, I think I'm not throwing anything else, but there's always a relationship between missiology and ecclesiology, but the church has always itself done the work of describing ourselves to the world. And that's just, people aren't really coming to that space anymore. And it's not, that's just the way it is right now.
Well, and it's different in different little places, and it's different in different culture, but in terms of Northern European culture in the Western spaces, that's certainly true. And so, figuring out how to continue to do this. And again, for me, YouTube was a total Jordan Peterson was making videos on YouTube. I should have had a clue when, that young Anabaptist called me up and said, I want you to mentor me. Why? Because I'm Reformed. You're Reformed minister? Yeah. I want you to mentor me. Well, how did you get Reformed? On the internet. Oh,
Well,
okay. What did I know? But I learned, and that's, so, we just talked about on the ground and in the locale, and at least in America on a zip code, but I think to a degree, so of course, joke about Rick, because Rick was the one who gave me this poster. The first Sunday after I started making videos, he marches into church and says, never been in a church before. Here, this is for you. And he gives me this poster. And, and Rick and I, have been on this adventure ever since. And Rick continues to teach me about the internet because, he's a decade younger than I am too. He's much more of a denizen of the internet than I am. And, every week he'll show me something, and I learn through his eyes and his reaction, knowing him. And that's, so that's part of the in-person that you can't really do without, because, people might watch me. Yesterday, I just did a conversation with Chad, the alcoholic, and he came here with his wife on vacation when I was gone on vacation. So we didn't get a chance to meet, but he left me these little guys, and he, but he said, it was just helpful to come to your Living Stones, your place, and, see the homeless people, and, you see all of the mess, and, okay. And I regularly now have people who will stop by. And okay, so now Paul is in context, and I understand him a little better, because just watching 10, 15 hours of video a week from me won't tell you what walking on site might inform you of in ways that you probably can't even describe.
Yeah. Well, I've appreciated your YouTube channel, particularly because of the way, well, again, I think this is the theme I'm trying to say, is learning how to be in the world and learning how to talk about things that are often so implicit in our own context, but learning how to be, to translate that, or to communicate those things, and to do that in a mutual way. And I think you model that in your channel. You can be a pastor, you can talk as a pastor, but take part in a conversation that isn't just about Christianity, or, and that's, I think, what I watch very carefully, because I think that's that's how I feel like my role is, just on not in a YouTube role, but on a one-on-one level.
Right.
So
right.
Yeah.
Well, that's helpful, and thank you. And it is good to compare notes, because I very much get the sense that, even though I'm obviously older than you, we both did grow up sort of, my parents were missionaries in some ways into Patterson.
Yes.
Neither of my parents had lived in a community quite like that. And, they dedicated 36 years of their lives doing countercultural work. And of course I went overseas. And so I'm always sensitive to culture, but also always with a desire to say, okay, how can my knowledge be used? It sounds so evangelical, to share the love of Jesus with others. I don't know any better way to say it. We can't escape who we are.
The patent is on that phrase.
That's right. That's right. I know how an Anabaptist would say it.
You have to cite it. Yeah. Huh?
I don't know how an Anabaptist would say it. I think pretty much the same way.
To serve.
Oh yeah, serve. There's a big word for the Anabaptists. Serve.
Yes.
Well, thank you, David. This is special. And those of you,
we'll look forward to you coming to Europe.
I've never been to Europe, so
oh my goodness.
I really want to get over there.
Yes.
I don't want to make, I've been really slow to make big plans still because COVID, are we going to have another twist, and have border lockdowns or, so it's kind of like, let's have this thing sort of settle down. And then at some point, definitely want to get over to Europe. So,
I think, there's a whole bunch. We'll organize a whole thing here for you. Our local estuary will be happy to have you. Yeah.
Well, I look forward to it. it. All right, David. It's great talking to you.
Thank you.
All right. And it's okay for me to post this?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I just got to make sure I want to post it. It's like, what have you done to my ministry? I didn't know. All right. Yeah. Take care. Bye-bye.